Hi, welcome to this session. We shall talk about colonialism, decolonization, and development in Africa. We intend to define key terms, and that is colonialism, imperialism, and decolonization. Explore some of the origins of colonialism. So we ask ourselves why was there colonialism, especially in Africa, and discuss the colonial regimes and strategies that were used by the colonizers, and discuss the effects, short-term and long-term effects of colonialism in Africa. So let's get started. Now, before we get to colonialism, we need to understand the roots of colonialism. So, in 1300, Ottoman Empire began, and in the presence of Ottoman Empire, there was also European Empire, and of course the Ottoman Empire was created by the Turkish tribes, so around 600 years ago, and of course the empire grew through wars and acquisition of land, imposing taxes on occupants. So the origin of the Ottoman Empire was in the current Turkey. There was just like any other empire, like the European Empire, if you know about the Roman empires and what. So the trade was taking on. People were exploited. The empire was expanding through acquisition of land and so on, and therefore having many occupants. And there was also trade between the Ottoman Empire and European empires in terms of goods and services, and even that is when slave trade also, the roots of slave trade began. So the Ottoman Empire, later on, of course, in around 1922, there was a fall of it, and it was as a result of many factors, including drought, floods, and financial crisis, corruption, and resistance. Of course, movement. People would resist the rule, the autocratic rule by the Ottoman leaders, and therefore a revolution, and of course also World War I in 1918. So this is how the Ottoman Empire had grown. So you can see in the middle there, that's where Turkey is right now. You can see Istanbul there. So you can see this gives you the chronological growth of the Ottoman Empire, and how they were acquiring land, even including, from the Middle East, the south part of southern part of Eastern Europe, and then also the northern part of Africa. So it started as a small a small acquisition of land, and then rule of the Turks, and then increased. Then, if you need more details about Ottoman Empire, you could visit this website for that particular. So after the Ottoman Empire, then of course, when it had begun in 1330, now the transatlantic trade began. And this was between the African, the Europe, and American continent. So began with the Portuguese, of course, exploring the coastal regions of Africa, the likes of Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so on. And of course, then other Western European countries joined, and that is how slave trade now began. So slaves were shipped from Africa to the Caribbean islands and the American to to work on plantations. So the plantations, of course, included tobacco, coffee, cotton, sugar, mining, and rice. So you can see the slaves were captured within inland of Africa, then traded through the coasts of Congo, Angola, and Sierra Leone and Senegal. So some were taken to Europe, but majority were taken to South America, and then others to the Caribbean islands and the US. And so that's how now you have the black Americans that are living there. So you can see between 1650 to 1860, approximately 10 to 15 million people were enslaved and through the transatlantic trade. So you can also see visit the Lewis T and see the transatlantic slave trade encyclopedia to get more information on that. So effects of slave trade, of course, there was depopulation in Africa, especially the young males, because the European were more interested in the young males because they could work well on plantations. The continent was left with limited labor force, poor economic performance because people that were supposed to be productive were also taken away, social divisions and political instabilities because the African tribes and ethnic groups were now fighting, even other within ethnic groups. The leaders were conniving with the slave traders to capture the inhabitants, so on. And then, of course, people lost identities and then gained new identities, and that is why now you have, so in quotes, the Negroes. By then, the Negroes, but now that is racist. You don't have to say that. So new identities. If you went there, you could find those people. So following the suppression of slave trade, of course, in 1860s, there was a move and advocacy for a stop on slave trade, and a new kind of African exploitation began, and that is colonialism. So, big question: is Africa a country or a continent? The reason why this is asked is because more often, I've had chances to go to Europe and the US, and you hear someone asking, "Oh, I know someone in Zimbabwe. Do you know he's called so and so? Do you know him?" So some of them, because they have not traveled, they think Africa is just a country, but this is a continent with many countries. Okay, so Africa is not a country indeed. Yeah, of course, it's not a country because it has its own diversity. Diversity in terms of growth within countries, diversity in terms of political regimes. There are those that are autocratic, democratic, and hybrids. Diversity in terms of war and conflict experiences. We all have our different histories and current conflicts. Diverse pre-colonial history. So most of us were colonized by different colonizers, various colonial regimes, distinct path towards independence. So we didn't get independence at the same time. And there are few giants and dwarfs, those that are grown and those that are still growing. So compare Nigeria, South Africa, those are big giants in Africa compared to these other small countries. Very different social development problems and large differences in terms of natural resources. You can't compare Gabon, DRC, and others with other countries because these two countries have an immense amount of resources. Okay. Also, you can look at landlocked or sea access and so on. But of course, we would somehow understand why others think that it is a country because of geography. The continent is the same. The general poor growth performance is relatively the same. That's why looked at as African. Africa is poor. Okay, of course, independence is commonly gained after between 1950s and 1960s. Of course, we have some that gained independence after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1990s. Okay, then you have post-colonial regimes that commonly non-democratic, but usually autocratic or authoritarian. In that case, of course, following the institutionalized kind of leadership that was following colonialism. So, yes, we have something in common: colonialism. Yeah, occupation by European powers, except Ethiopia and Liberia. Of course, Liberia was not colonized. So the past and present Africa is, as we can say to some extent, that the past and present Africa is as a result of colonialism and imperialism and exploitation of European countries. So, and therefore colonialism processes, structures, and their effects on development in Africa can be explained. Okay, so what is colonialism? Involves annexation or capture and direct government of one country by another country. The latest, I think, is annexation of the some parts of Ukraine by Russia. So, but yeah, back then, of course, a country could just come and by force take over another country. So that's colonialism. Annexation or capture or direct government of one country by another country. So it's a political concept. Don't confuse it with imperialism. Imperialism is an economic concept, as we shall see in a moment. So, a direct overall domination of one country by another on the basis of state power being in the hands of a foreign power. It is as simple as that. So, it's a direct form of imperialism, but not to be confused or equated with imperialism. On the other hand, imperialism is any relationship of effective domination or control, political or economic or direct or indirect, of one nation over the other. But there is no takeover of leadership. Remember, this is different from colonialism. It is an economic concept because imperialism has to do with domination in terms of trade. Okay, trade. So some countries can put trade embargoes on other countries that they should not trade in some parts. So that is imperialism. Okay, so if, for instance, African goods and services cannot go beyond African continent, then just because of foreign economic policies, then that would be imperialism. Okay, so colonialism as one of the driving forces towards imperialism. Yeah, of course, we can say that imperialism is as a result or is influenced by colonialism. And at a later stage, we can look at issues of neo-colonialism, whereby you have some kind of influence by foreign powers on Africa again, even after African countries have gained independence. So not all poor or third developing countries were colonized. Many were colonized except Ethiopia and Liberia in Africa. Ethiopia was about to be colonized by Italy, but then it was liberated. Then Liberia was formed as a country just to bring back the slaves from America, Europe, and South America, to bring them back to their continent, and that's how Liberia was formed. So Liberia is a continent formed of slaves that were brought back to Africa. Iran and Afghanistan in the Middle East were never colonized. Thailand, China, Japan, Nepal in Asia never colonized. So So colonialism happened between 1885 and around 1960s, mainly, of course, mainly. Like I said earlier, there are some other countries that were that did not gain independence until after 70s and onwards. Okay, so they followed the end of slave trade, like I said earlier, and it was by mainly by European countries, including Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. Began with the King Leopold's occupation of the Congo, that's the DRC, and of course the other Congo. King Leopold was a Belgian king who came to Congo to start exploiting resources through the Congo. So you can see exploitation of the Congo resources is not just a recent phenomenon. It has been there since the end of slave trade. So then, of course, after King Leopold took over the Congo, other European countries impositions were now experienced in African countries. By then, of course, African countries did not exist as they are demarcated now. By then, the territories were demarcated according to ethnic groups. Okay. So, of course, the competition for power between European countries led to what we call the scramble for Africa. So the scramble for Africa began, of course, was began following the Berlin Act. The Berlin Act was as a result of the conference in the Berlin in November 1884 and February 1885, led by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And the treaty was actually stipulating the principles on all procedures or protocols on how Africa can be taken over. So, of course, such a conference was done to reduce on conflicts between the European powers that wanted to take over Africa. So the article stipulated principles of notification. So one country would notify all others that I'm going to take this part. Okay, principles of effective occupation, freedom of trade in the Congo Basin, freedom of navigation through the Niger-Congo rivers, freedom of trade to all nations, and suppression of slave trade. Okay, by land or sea. So therefore, the end of slave trade resulted in the beginning of colonialism. So Africa was partitioned without, of course, its participation, and therefore, without participation, that meant that invasions would happen, and therefore colonialism. Okay, so this is Africa before, around 1880. So you have there your Afrikaners and tribes and ethnic groups and so on, from just Cape Colony in South Africa up in Algeria, okay. Then following colonialism, that is our Africa today, okay, following the scramble for Africa and partitions. So this is by 1930 how Africa looked like, okay. So why was there colonialism? Basic role of slave trade, okay, accumulation of capital, because that was the aim of the Europeans. The need for invasion to accumulate capital, of course, and need for changes in the modes of production from basic agriculture to industrialization. And so Europeans had shifted from agriculture to industrialization, but their population was growing, and therefore they needed other raw materials. But those raw materials would be gotten from Africa, exported to Europe, and then returned back to Africa as processed goods. So they take goods cheaply as raw materials, go to Europe, get processed through the industries, because Africa was not industrialized by then. Then the goods return to Africa, you buy them highly, and therefore the profits are made for the Europeans. Okay. Industrial Revolution, of course, I've just talked about the raw materials, finding market for manufactured goods, I talked about that. But of course, also finding ways to get enough food to sustain the increasing population in Europe, and export of power to Africa to exploit mines, farms, markets, and so on. There were different colonial regimes and strategies experienced by Africans, but of course imposed by the Europeans. So there's direct control of Africans, Africa's political and economic administration. So they come and take over the leadership. African also forced to accept international division of labor, and therefore for them to produce raw materials, not to manufacture. So because if you start manufacturing, then the Europeans would lose. So there is also indirect rule through traditional institutions, whereby the British would come, negotiate with the traditional leaders, and then through the traditional leaders they rule over African ethnic kingdoms. So for instance, that's what happened in Uganda. Because take over the Mwanga and Kabarega, and then the Kabaregas and Mwangas would then use their traditional powers to work with the British to exploit the continent. There is also a strategy of assimilation and association of policies by integrating colonies into main colonial governments. It's a method used by French. Even now it's being used, although the French are getting, with the recent announcement by President Macron that the French would withdraw. So for the French, they would come in and then establish their institutions as they were the other side. So behind any kind of occupation or any institutions in Africa, at the top there would be a Frenchman. The structure was as this established in Africa was as the same as the structure in the French. Then the other kind of strategy or regime was forcing colonies to accept all methods, whether you like it or not. And this method was used by King Leopold in the Congo, and we shall see later some of the effects of that. So you have subjugation of African communities by conquest through wars, raids, and kidnaps, just as you see the picture on your right. That is a Kenyan village whereby the British soldiers were capturing some of the slaves. Forced labor by King Leopold in the DRC. Payment of wages, you had to pay also. They were paid low wages, because if they pay you more, then you have more bargaining power. So if they pay you low, and you keep just working for the few pennies. Taxation, so even the slaves themselves, were taxed. Their plantation, you grow crops, and then you are taxed, and you bring some of the produces. Also monetization of the economy. So instead of using the local currencies, traditional way of exchange of goods, by then of course mostly barter trade, there was introduction of money, of new currencies, and therefore use of currencies for specific countries, okay, that had colonized. Most cases they talk about colonialism as a bad thing, but we can't entirely say that it was bad. There were some positive impacts of colonialism in Africa. So you have, of course, education, our education system. If you see, for instance, in Uganda right now, okay, we are teaching in English. The system, the way it is done, is as that of Britain. So education. Then changes in governance systems, whereby now we have structured ones, but before it was monarchies ruled by kingdoms, but now we have formal states. Colonialism shaped, of course, so political and economic institutions, so how markets work and so on. By then, these things of stock markets and what were not existing in Africa. Then development of market structures. Now we are to be able to work on the international scene. Urbanization. And then, of course, development of transport systems. So on your right, through these pictures, you can see the railroads, city locations, and urban growth in sub-Saharan Africa between 1960s and 2000. So if you follow that, you will see that the transport system and the urbanization is within the routes where railroads and city locations were passing. So take an example of Kenya here. You see from the coast, east coast to west coast, you can see that's how the railroads were moving, because the railroads were constructed by the Europeans or colonizers to transport raw materials from inland to the coast, so that at the coast they can be shipped to Europe. So that construction of alongside the main railroads, you'll find urban centers started developing, because people would have to take rest, and then also within the small towns, also that's where also trade was happening, and that itself led to bigger markets and then urban centers. So these are some of the positive impacts of colonialism. But of course, as always, the negative impacts outweigh the positive ones. So extraction of Africa's rich raw materials, which is still happening right now, but that is neo-colonialism now. We all know what is happening. For instance, I'll keep referring to the DRC because it's a basic example that we have, where raw materials are still, in terms of natural resources, are still being taken away. Taxation and low wages, so that increased poverty levels, dependence on colonizers even after gaining independence. We don't know whether there was decolonization or whether there's neo-colonialism, because some countries still depend on foreign policies stipulated by Europeans. The roots of corruption began by then, because, for instance, take an example of the British that would come, get through the traditional leaders, give them, of course, some power, more powers and resources, to use them as their leaders to influence whatever they wanted to do. So corruption began from, then. Colonial and post-colonial ethnic conflicts, which have not ended. We all know what is happening in Africa, even at the moment. It's that some are, for some reasons, we can relate that to colonialism. And then there is also dehumanization of Africa, the Africans, in terms of human rights and so on. So an example is here. You can see this is a Congolese girl who was taken to Belgium in 1958 in a human zoo, because those, of course, the Belgians did not know how black people looked like. So a small zoo was established in Belgium for people to come and just take a look at how blacks are. You can also see what King Leopold, this is the King Leopold of the Belgian. So whenever you would be told to produce a certain amount of produces through agriculture and also mining, and you do not live up to your bargain, the followers or workers of King Leopold would be instructed to cut you. Of course, they are motivated to cut you because they were told, for instance, if you bring the more hands you bring, then you have freedom to go back to the Belgium, then you leave Africa. So most people, of course, were desperate to go back because they were suffering, they were dying, they were missing their home countries. So they would be motivated to do whatever the king had instructed. So this is the dehumanization I am talking about. Okay. More negative impacts, disentanglements of indigenous economies and social and political structures through the scramble and partition, of course. Then classification of societies. By then, we were living in a communal kind of structure whereby people would share, work together, and so on. But then with colonialism, there's this kind of divide and rule led to some of the divisions between individuals, households, but also communities. Then, of course, Christian heterogeneities, divisions, and effects on development. Yeah, so all these are some of the effects. So, in beginning of 1950s through 1960s, many African countries gained their independence, and that's what we call decolonization. So decolonization is actions of or processes of colonial powers withdrawing from colonized or occupied areas to leave it independent in form of state power and governance. And you can see right here on your right, the map shows which years each of African countries gained independence. Of course, except Liberia and Ethiopia, that were never colonized. But all others, you will see, if you take a look, you'll see years, and mainly between 1950s and onwards. But of course, the likes of South Africa, that was 1931, and then followed by others that mainly happened in 1960s. But of course, we also have others that happened in 70s. You have, for instance, Zimbabwe. You have Angola, and so on. Okay, including also Djibouti, that is 1970s. But most were in 50s and 60s. Okay. Also, just to note that Western Sahara was still under, it is still actually disputed and still under UN administration until 1991. But even now, the Morocco and other West African countries are still fighting to take over the Western Sahara. Okay. So what happens then after post-colonial? So there are long-term effects of colonialism. Of course, they are still felt in Africa. Imperialism and neo-colonialism are still present. Imperialism, we talked about it as control or foreign policies that control how Africans can trade or not. Neo-colonialism means a new form of colonialism whereby, yes, the colonizers do not have direct influence or direct rule in African countries, but they can influence what happens in Africa. So you know what the French guys are doing in West Africa. You know what the Belgians are doing in DRC. We also know how the British have influence over its colonies, including Uganda, Kenya, and so on. So there is some kind of influence from the former colonizers. Africa's dependence on developing countries for aid, and of course we shall explore this in a session, I think session 6, on aid and its effects, whether it's working for Africa or not. So that kind of dependence. Then you have post-colonial conflicts in Africa and their effects. So these are some of the so we have areas of colonial conflict such as Kenya, Angola, Namibia, Mozambique, Sudan, Ethiopia, Morocco, Algeria, and so on. But then also after colonialism, we still had conflicts in Angola, Zimbabwe. You know what is happening even now in Mozambique. There are tribal conflicts. Sudan, the conflicts are there. Western Sahara conflict is still there. Ethiopia now, you know what is happening between the Tigray and Ethiopia. So some of the conflicts that we're experiencing in Africa could be traced back through colonialism, okay, and after, of course, the effects after colonialism, okay. Some key book that you could get engaged in to get more insights on colonialism and its effects, okay, by Sterios and Elias. So you could check it out. I also provided it in your Moodle. We were talking about imperialism in decolonizing Africa. So of course there are still competitions between the West and East for Africa. So the West, in terms of China and the US and other European countries. So of course this imperialism started after World War II in 1945. And after 1945, there was what we call Cold War between the USA and Russia, okay, because Russia was supporting communism while USA was supporting capitalism. So that kind of Cold War between so Russia was influencing African countries that would support communism, and then USA would also influence African countries that would support capitalism. So that kind of war and division in Africa also, of course, was influencing the kind of trade and so on that would, how Africans would trade with which countries on the globe. But now, after the end of Cold War in 1990, between Russia and USA, now we have the competition of Africa between the West, which is USA, and Europe and China, because China is now gaining more influence on how Africa operates. We shall look at, again, this more in the session on aid in Africa. So imperialistic economic investments in Africa are also happening. Of course, you saw the growing presence of China in Africa and importation of Chinese companies, labor, goods, and services in Africa. That itself influences on how our economies in Africa would work. Okay, so you can visit this site to see how, for instance, China has had an effect on Africa. Why is Africa delaying to catch up even after independence? Of course, Africa is extractive rather than inclusive institutions. So, for instance, settler versus non-settler colonies. So, you could, for African countries where, for instance, the colonizers put institutions that were inclusive, therefore including working together with the African governments, such have worked a little bit well. Take an example of South Africa had inclusive institutions. Inclusive institutions were influenced by the idea that South Africa's climatic conditions and so on are relatively similar as those of Europeans. So Europeans were not shying away from settling in South Africa to do whatever they wanted to. That is why South Africa, you'll find more whites in South Africa, and therefore establishing institutions that were inclusive. Okay. But then if you go to these sub-Saharan African countries, inclusive of most of our countries, most of the institutions were extractive, whereby the colonizers were just aiming at getting raw materials and taking them away. They couldn't settle because of many factors, including diseases such as malaria and so on. So climate conditions were not conducive for them to settle. So they would just come in to take things compared to other. So that's why you might find that South Africa, for instance, is doing well compared to other countries because of the types of institutions that were left by colonizers. Then corruption and bad governance, of course, non-democratic political structures are bringing in issues. They are delaying development, as we saw, for instance, yesterday I gave you an example on Singapore versus Uganda. There is also question state capacities and fragilities, continuous civil wars. So even, for instance, take an example of South Sudan. Since they gained independence, I think 2011, up to now, they are still fragile. They are still experiencing civil wars. So you ask yourself, when will they take over to rebuild the new country? Foreign aid and debt accumulation, Africa is gaining more debt than what it can afford to pay, and that also brings about more influence by the Western world or China on how Africa should grow. The external factors such as diseases and disasters, of course, those are natural factors. And of course, we still have limited technology, industrialization, and our market structure is not good. Post-colonial development, yeah, despite many African challenges, of course, Africa is still catching up. We can't say it's not doing well. Many countries have, following their independencies, they have done well. Botswana, Senegal, Nigeria, South Africa, and so on. And of course, through better education, services, industrialization, entrepreneurship, and innovations. But of course, most African countries need political, economic, and social restructuring to be able to achieve development at a faster rate. Bottom line is that we need urgent creation of our own indigenous identities. Africa can also do well if it realizes the urgency to utilize the vast number of resources that we have. Of course, if that begins with the political institutions, if good governance is there, then these resources can be utilized well. Industrialize to use the local resources that we have, switch from imports to exports, build localized good governance structures, and of course, root out corruption. But of course, some countries, such as Rwanda, have been able to take an advantage of foreign aid, and Rwanda is among the fastest growing countries in Africa. Of course, at first, Rwanda was taking foreign aid to regain momentum, but now, in the recent years, Rwanda is now shying away from foreign aid. It does not need aid. Kagame said it cannot be able to. He can't be able to afford to save his own people if he's still incurring debts. So to do that, he's shying away from foreign aid. But because he was doing well with foreign aid, most countries keep coming to Rwanda to give aid, but Rwanda has reduced on its intake of foreign aid. So it's doing well. So we can't say that all countries must depend on foreign aid to be able to grow. Okay, these are some of the resources you could depend on to read more or gain more on how Africa has been doing well. But number 1 and 2 are mostly important, especially number 1. Number 1 by Stephen Ocheni, Basil, and Nonko. Gives a very nice, succinct analysis of colonialism and its impact in Africa. And in fact, it's the main recommended reading on your platform. It's not big. You can engage it in a few hours, and you get enough of what colonialism is and its impact on Africa. So thank you.